the least qualified people to talk about two things. Climate change and governance are politicians. Because politicians have not done much about climate change, and really you shouldn't trust politicians when it comes to governance, and at least good governance. But I'm here at the inaugural Paro Forum, and I want to congratulate founding Dean Sangye Doji, my friend of the Jigme Singye Wangchuk Law School, for organizing this forum. And through you and your faculty, I wish to submit my profound gratitude to the President, the Honorable President, Her Royal Highness, Ajit Sonam Dichin. So happy Losa. This is a fantastic way to begin our new year. And as you can see, the three mounds out there, they're actually hills in the next valley. Many of you Bhutanese would be aware. I'm not sure many of you younger students would be aware where this is. This is in Ha. They are the Meri Pinsum. They represent the three bodhisattvas of Jambyang, Tshering, and Chana Doji. And in Bhutan, as all of you know, we celebrate happiness. We take gross national happiness seriously, we celebrate happiness, and most of our guests expect to really enjoy discussions and discourses on happiness. And so we will begin our talk by talking about threats, in fact, not happiness, and existential threats for humankind, no less. What David Boyd mentioned, he talked of human rights. This is beyond human rights. This is our right to survival as a human race. There are many existential threats. To me, asteroids is one of them. 66 million years ago, a 10-kilometer, and a big asteroid measuring 10 kilometers in diameter slammed into the earth and destroyed all the dinosaurs and all living beings at that time. So asteroids is a definite existential threat. However, we really don't need to worry about that because we have scientists peering into the space day in and day out, night and day. And I'm sure that we will be safe from asteroid impact, or at least we will know about any impending impact many, many years before any such thing were to take place. Of more concern is nuclear catastrophe. There's like 19,000 nuclear warheads in the world. Yeah, we can get a few crazy chaps, but you'd imagine that leaders would exercise caution and would not, in spite of the fact that we've collected an arsenal to destroy our world several times over, would not really press that button. The third is global epidemics. About 700 years ago, the bubonic plague killed something like 100 to 200 million people over 2 or 3 years. More recently, about 100 years ago, Spanish flu killed something like 20 to 50 million people. And most recently, the COVID pandemic has killed at least 7 million people. Infected about 700 million of us. And here in Bhutan, we've been very fortunate because we've lost only 21 lives to the pandemic. 21 lives, in fact, all of them, very old, very ill. And so actually caught COVID during the process of their departure. We've got to be grateful to our enlightened king for saving us, for protecting us through this pandemic. I mention this because the COVID pandemic should have killed many more people than the Spanish flu or indeed the bubonic plague. But with today's technology, with today's science, we can rest assured that perhaps it's not quite an existential threat. There's one more though, that's climate change. Unlike the asteroids impact or the dangers of nuclear catastrophes or epidemics, which are all, we feel a sense of urgency. They're critical. Climate change, everybody talks about it, but there's very little action. We all know how dangerous it is, yet there's very little action. And this is where climate change can indeed be a true existential threat to the survival of humankind. Climate change, the cause of rising temperatures. Now, the Paris Agreement, which David mentioned, was signed in, was discussed, was agreed to in 2015. This is almost 8 years ago. And the whole idea of the Paris Agreement was that we've got to limit temperature increases. We've got to limit global warming. And guess what? The last 8 years, which really neatly, ironically corresponds to the Paris Agreement, have been the hottest years, 8 hottest years in recorded history. Or rather, since measurements on temperatures were kept. The Paris Agreement aimed to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. We are already beyond 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And by 2030, as soon as 7 years down the line, we could reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. And that's not good news, because global increases in global temperature will melt ice. Polar ice caps, our precious glaciers, and the melting of ice and glaciers will contribute to rising sea levels. Rising sea levels means entire nations will disappear, could disappear. Kiribati Islands, Maldives Islands, but it's not just the islands. It's entire coastal communities, and guess what? 3/4 of humanity live along the coast. 3/4 of humanity, which is like 6 billion people, live within 50 kilometers of the sea. So if this temperatures continue to rise, if ice continues to melt, if seas continue to rise, we are going to get people migrating as refugees, climate refugees, as never before. This is relevant to Bhutan because we are surrounded by densely populated areas that are very vulnerable to rising sea levels. Leadership matters in the fight against climate change. In Bhutan, we've been very fortunate. We've been blessed with extraordinary leaders. This is His Majesty the Fourth King, crowning, resigning, abdicating, and crowning His Majesty the Fifth King. Because we have enlightened leaders, Bhutan has benefited in many ways. Although we are a small, poor country, a country that's landlocked, we benefited in many ways. We are the custodians, the architects and custodians of a unique development philosophy, one that places the happiness and well-being of its citizens at the center of the purpose of development, gross national happiness. Our enlightened kings have ensured that forest cover in Bhutan exceeds 70%. Our enlightened kings have protected more than 50% of our country as nature reserves, national parks, wildlife sanctuaries. And as a result, because of enlightened leadership, we are a net carbon negative country. We sequester 3 times more carbon than we emit. Leadership matters. We look to our kings as bodhisattvas, as enlightened beings. Bodhisattvas are enlightened beings who can enter nirvana, can enter Buddhahood, can escape the circle, the cycle of birth and death. But they choose a life of selfless service rather than entering into nirvana. And that's how we see our kings. We have many bodhisattvas in Bhutan. My favorite are the Riksun Gembo. And it's not just because of the 3 mountains that protect Ha Valley, the picture I showed you earlier. The three Riksungyembo Bodhisattvas represent wisdom, compassion, and courage. The first Bodhisattva, Jambayang, represents wisdom. You will see Jambayang's statue and paintings in every school, in every monastery throughout the country, because Jambayang represents wisdom. There's a story during the time of the Buddha when monks would congregate and listen to the teachings of the Buddha. There would be bodhisattvas also occasionally teaching the monks. And some monks heard that Jambayang is going to be giving some teachings, and they were excited, and they heard that Jambayang was wise and would impart wisdom to them. And so they waited. They waited for hours, and then days, and then weeks. Some grew impatient, some grew angry, some left. Weeks later, Jambayang arrived. And when the monks asked Jambayang, "Where have you been? We've been waiting for you." Jambayang said, "I've been with the children of the poor. I've been among the ladies of the night. I've been with farmers. I've been with servants." And the monks got angry. Some of them were puzzled, some of them were angry, some of them threw insults, until there was a commotion and the Lord Buddha announced. Jambayang, Manjushri, spent the time among people providing wisdom. Provided enough wisdom to 500 children of the poor, 500 women of the night, 500 farmers, 500 servants. And these people have enough wisdom to spread that wisdom so that many more can gain enlightenment. And so the monks were very apologetic, and then they received their teachings. Just a story, a fable, to showcase the importance of wisdom. Cherezi, Avalokteshwara. Now Cherezi, another bodhisattva, dedicated his life to saving, to providing enlightenment, to helping as many sentient beings gain enlightenment and escape from samsara. And Cherezi was so determined by the task, but overwhelmed at the challenge, that his head split into many parts. The Buddha, Yepami, felt sorrow and assembled the heads together, and therefore there are 11 heads on Cherezi, on one form of Cherezi. And then his hands broke into 1,000 pieces. And again, Buddha Amitiyas assembled all those hands and gave Cherezi 1,000 hands along with 11 heads to liberate sentient beings from samsara. So this is a quick story of Cherezi. The third Bodhisattva is Chanadoji. Chanadoji, Vajrapani, it is said, accompanied the Lord Buddha when he left his palace at the age of 29. When he left his palace, the comfort of his palace, when he left his powers, his riches, his wife, his child, to lead an ascetic life in search of truth. And that is the power of Chanadoji. So the three of them together, I believe, are the attributes that are necessary for an enlightened leadership. However, an enlightened leader must also not just have wisdom and compassion and courage, but must demonstrate selfless service, because that is the true nature of the Bodhisattva. In Bhutan, we have been blessed to have enlightened leaders. And that's why I'm really excited. This is my first time at the Jimmy Singh Wangchuk School of Law. This very institution is named after the legacy of our enlightened leader, Jimmy Singh Wangchuk. Climate change and governance. Climate change and enlightened leadership in Bhutan. Enlightened leadership, the wisdom to understand the dangers of climate change before others do. The wisdom, the compassion, to feel the compassion of the effects of climate change on our generation in Bhutan, but also on people who may live outside Bhutan. And most importantly, compassion to feel the pain and suffering of those in the future. And to have the courage to act now. That's why in our constitution, there are references to gross national happiness, but there's a very specific reference to maintain 60% of our country under forest cover. That's why we have ratified the Paris Agreement. Now in the Paris Agreement, our overarching pledge is to remain carbon neutral. We are carbon negative. Unfortunately, there are very few countries making any progress towards achieving their pledges. Forget about meeting them. Guyana, a very small country, a strip of our land in Western Africa, seems to be making a little progress. But really the big countries, the richer countries, the more advanced countries need to do a lot more. This is just two of the many legislations that we have that are relevant to protection of the environment and climate change in Bhutan. 22 international treaties and conventions related to climate change, biodiversity, environment have been ratified. And this is all a part of enlightened leadership, governance, good governance, and climate change. I'd like to reiterate my congratulations to the law school for holding this forum, because this is continuing the legacy of our enlightened leaders. Enlightened leadership. Leadership with the attributes of wisdom, compassion, and courage. Leadership that puts selfless service over immediate profit. It's what's required to fight climate change and to make progress towards achieving the targets of the Paris Agreement. This sounds heavy. It is not heavy. All of us have these attributes. We need to discover them. Some of you may have seen this movie. This is one of my favorites, The Wizard of Oz. The Scarecrow goes on this journey. Well, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and Lion go through a journey and go on a journey. And the Scarecrow is looking for a brain. The Scarecrow thinks he's dumb, he does not have a brain. The Tin Man thinks he does not have a heart, does not have compassion. And the scared lion, the cowardly lion, feels he does not have courage. And as they go on their journey, along with Dorothy, by the time they reach the wizard, by the time they reach the end of the journey, they discover that during the journey they all had, all along, their attributes. The Scarecrow had a lot of brains, the Tin Man had a lot of compassion, and the lion displayed courage. The story is very simple. All of us have these attributes. It is our challenge to let these attributes percolate in our actions and in our policy, and let the driving force be selfless service. That is enlightened leadership. That's the type of governance that's required to fight climate change the world over. A final reminder, for the students who have not been to Ha, please visit the next valley and pay tribute to the Mary Pinsum. They represent our Riksumbyumba. Thank you very much.